right, past, present, and future of micro frontends. I want to start with a little bit of a history lesson. Darth Vader, one of the great villains in cinematic history, was already saying, when I left you, I was but the learner. So reflecting about the past is a good thing, and we should also do that when we think about micro frontends. Especially, and that's one of the purposes of the conference, to just see where all the different perspectives come from, why certain terminology is a little bit overloaded and quite often difficult then to just throw out in some conversation. And one of the reasons for having this conference is to bring together people with different opinions, different insights, and to find a common basis to continue and make micro frontends quite a standard topic, not just something you come up with in very exotic scenarios, but something that potentially almost every project can actually utilize in one form or the other. Now, thinking back a little bit, the first time that the term micro frontends really appeared on a broad radar was on the famous SwordWorks Tech Radar in November 2016 edition. They put it on Assess. And if you would read now this paragraph, I'm not going to, what you would realize is that, of course, they already identified some of the core features that, for instance, micro frontends is actually an organizational approach. And the core benefits that you can now have full stack or full ownership teams, full ownership of a feature. But implementation-wise, it was much different, of course, to what we know today. Of course, also the breadth and the range wasn't there. And for me personally, of course, there was also a little bit of a touch point, because back then in 2016, I was working on a smart home solution. And what we wanted to do here is come up with a really great new app for it, right? That should have been a cross-platform app. It was not the best decision, but that's another story. But one of the key things that we wanted to introduce is that the ownership of a feature of the smart home ecosystem, and that is a device usually, really can be taken by one team. So for instance, if there is a team making an integration for a Philips Hue device, for instance, then this team is not only responsible for the device itself, but also responsible for the device driver, so something in the hardware, and for the representation of that device if it's included in the end user's portfolio of devices. And that led us to an approach which, later on I found out that is actually micro frontends what we did here. So what we allowed is to have this kind of a pluggable system where only, let's say, core parts have been in the ownership of a central team, but then there were many teams, they were all responsible for different devices, different types of scenarios as well. And of course, they progressed, and already 1 year after the first appearance in the SwordWorks Tech Radar, we've seen that they moved it on from assess to trial, actually, and also to refine the text a little bit. And that was actually quite crucial, because at this point in time, they were already talking about the pages and components, and it was clear at this point that it is not now only servers that are doing something, but actually you can have multiple directions where you want to stitch these micro frontends together from a technical point of view. On an organizational point of view, of course, nothing has changed, because what we actually want to do here, we want to, let's say, get serious with microservices, right? Microservices has one drawback, and one person who really realized that is also one of the speakers of this conference is Michael Gers. And what Michael did is that he formed a website that had really a lot of impact called micro-frontends.org. And this has proven to be a really valuable source of insights, and that it is translated now in, I think, 7 languages is just a testament of that. So Michael really explored what you can do with micro frontends, how you can compose it, what the different ways exist, what are their drawbacks, what are their advantages, and how you can leverage it. Michael also came up with a really neat example that I always go back to if I start to explore new kinds of patterns, which is the tractor shop. And we will also see that in a minute. But before that, one thing I also admire Michael for is his ability to make really great diagrams. And in his book, he, unfortunately, in the printed version, they're only in gray. So I always encourage everyone to get the ebook because these are in color. He has images like this one, which really showcases now why you want to go from microservices to micro frontends. Now, if you have microservices, that's great. I mean, it's not, let's say, something that you need to have, but if you have it, that's great. But it only gets you so far because usually you also have an UI, and therefore you have potentially a front-end monolith. So you have one team, and that will actually need to align with all the backend teams. And since you have that, potentially you have other cross-cutting concerns formed in some central teams like business team or an operations team. And of course, again, there's now alignment needed because the service teams alone, they can't decide anything, right? They always need to align. And of course, also the other teams need to align. So you have a lot of inter-team communication. And of course, the question that Michael asked, how can we fix this? How can we improve it? And what he found out is that micro frontends actually does that because suddenly you get real verticals. You just have now one of the front-end guys in your team, and that team forms a full unit. And it's now not driven about, well, something that you place in a service, but it's really driven about a feature. So you have real feature teams end-to-end capable of coming up with the feature, deploying and maintaining it. And that was the real benefit of micro frontend. So again, there's nothing said here about implementation, but there's everything said that micro frontends is an organizational pattern, and the clear benefit is that it gives you the ability to form fully autonomous teams that can just work independently. In a real world scenario, of course, they will still do some alignment, but it should be minimalistic and just, of course, to be on the same page, but nothing crucial for the implementation. So I mentioned the tractor shop. I want to do a couple of demos in this talk. So let's just go ahead and have a look here. Now, what we can see, I will actually publish this repository soon. It's already on GitHub, but private at the moment, is my demo one, Tractor. I have in here, I hope it's large enough. I have 4 folders. Those could be 4 repositories if you want to. For simplicity, I just have them all in one structure here. And we have an application shell, which is rather minimalistic. So it only has an HTML file. But this HTML file does 2 things. First of all, it already says, well, I'm not alone here. I actually want to use something. And what I want to use is actually a component from a micro frontend. In this case, it's the so-called product page component. And I also need to embed these micro frontends that I'm using. And in this case, the decision was that while micro frontend forms, well, let's say 1 unit of deployment, it deploys its component in individual scripts. So if a micro frontend like the one from the blue team has, let's say, 2 components, it's 2 scripts here. And each script represents a web component. They communicate via events, so standard custom events. So everything that's used here is standard techniques that are available. We use ESMs. That just makes a lot of things easier. For instance, we don't need a bundler or anything and can still write nice code. And this is how that solution looks. So let's let it run. Just run all. Hopefully, everything starts up. I think it should be already running. So let's have a look. Localhost 1234. And what we can see is this famous Fractal shop. The individual components are always, let's say, displayed with a little bit of a border, a dash border, the color indicating to what team they belong. So we have the 3 micro frontends, red, blue, and green. And if you go around, that feels a little bit like a single page application. If I press the button, this thing here updates. There's an event being emitted. So other micro frontends could also listen to that and say, oh, there's now something at the card. I also want to do something here. Otherwise, we just under the hood change attributes. Since these are just web components, they are listening to attribute changes. And the representation of the component changes. Now, so far to that, what we can say is by using ESMs, you can also solve issues like how do I get now my files in there, for instance, a CSS file. Well, you can just use features like new URL and use import meta URL for getting the base path of your micro frontend. And these are things that you always need to think about, that you're not here, let's say, running on a known server, but actually you will be embedded in some application and you will need to find out what your base URL is. These are things that will appear in pretty much all micro frontend solutions, and quite often they're, let's say, solved under the hood in form of some framework. But of course, since we're not using anything here, just bare web components, what the web gives us, this is how it looks like. Other than that, I mean, as mentioned, that's just a web component. We define it here, for instance, as basket info. Great. Now, moving on. What we could also identify, not only from this example, but of course from all the knowledge that was built up until this point, is that there are, of course, certain expectations, partially organizational, but of course technical, that you can have on micro frontends. And this is a list that is, well, not, let's say, officially printed somewhere. I came up with this. So if you are not happy with something, or if you say there are properties missing, then yeah, feel free to add them. But these are 10 properties that I identified, which we see across all solutions, either demanded or present already. And some of these things, they are sometimes really hard to, let's say, align together. As an example, bullet point number 4, distributed debugging, and number 9, distributed repositories, they can be conflicting. While, of course, a good micro frontend solution allows to debug certain things and also, of course, have this distribution aspect covered in here, that you also have your source code now scattered across repositories usually doesn't help. Because if you start debugging and now would have to place a breakpoint in a solution that you don't have, well, that's quite difficult, isn't it, right? So quite often, things, of course, would be simpler if, for instance, instead of using distributed repositories, at least for the things you want to debug, you use something like a monorepo. But doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just quite often it's not very high on the list that both things need to be fulfilled, right? Other things, of course, also appear if we think about tooling for micro frontends, and we come up with a tool that helps us sharing dependencies. Most popular, arguably, is module federation. Then, of course, this thing will solve this one box, but maybe it doesn't solve others directly, like, for instance, the resilience when a micro frontend goes down. So you would still need to place in this isolation layer, right? A full framework, of course, would try to cover more of these bullet points. Now, that being said, in total, you can say it all depends what is important for you. So certain things, of course, of this list, you might say, this is also what I would expect. And other parts, you would say, well, scratch that. I'm not even sure what that word means. So potentially it is not really important for you. Right. And people started exploring this back in the days. And as already said, the first, implementations, they were all server-side driven. And even in 2019, it was still very popular, of course, to, when talking about micro frontends, to only mention the server-side composition. And in my opinion, that is quite natural, because if we look back at the web evolution in general, well, the server is, of course, where it all started. So, of course, it's also where we start our journey with micro frontends. Now, the web evolved, and so did, of course, our understanding of micro frontends. So the web evolved from monolithic architectures to introducing a separation between backend and frontend. That, of course, had some advantages at some point. Thinking about applications like Google Maps, Google Mail, when they were introduced, it was quite revolutionary. Suddenly, you could reload data. They offered an API. And that API that became also, well, quite popular with the introduction of mobile apps, because suddenly you needed a way to get into data. And then having a full single-page application, as we know it today, was just your one step away, because all you need to say is, why invest also in rendering HTML out when I anyway want to have a rich interactive experience on the client? Now, all the focus on the backend led to microservices as an organizational pattern. It's not that there were not other patterns of distributing services or work in the backend beforehand. SOAP, for instance, comes to my mind. But microservices has proven to be, well, quite the right amount of not saying what the implementation should be, but giving you already enough guidance how it should look like then when you do it. And also, of course, what that means for your organization. And now the next step, of course, is to actually put in the work and mirror what we did on the back end in the front end now. And whatever you want to call it, I mean, this, what is called here app shell, that could be something else, right? Like gateway could be something else on the back end. App shell could be something else. It could also be your reverse proxy if you use a server-side solution. But nevertheless, you always need a point where the orchestration happens, and that might be what you call an app shell. And then you have your individual teams that provide now features or fragments that are used in this composition together. But if we're talking about the past and how we came to this point, it's also important that things progressed, and sometimes progress also leaves behind solutions. So for instance, all the Mosaic 9 stuff, which was arguably at the beginning of Micro Frontends the most popular way to do it in form of a framework, that got officially archived half a year ago by Zalando. So they own Taylor, Skipper, the whole Mosaic 9 suite of services. And this is now not used any longer. And the repository is archived. And they are not the only ones. As an example, Fring.js, when I learned about this project, they were already gone. But they had also a couple of really great ideas. And yeah, unfortunately, they're no longer maintaining it. According to the authors, they fulfilled their goals and essentially reached a stage where they think this is fine to no longer maintain it. Great. Now, this is where I entered the stage, because we are now in about 2019, and this is where, after the smart home projects and several others, I felt that it's time to put this, what was refined over the years, into, in my opinion, a really fruitful solution, and something that you want to use for certain kind of scenarios, put it in an open source framework. And so in February 2019, I wrote a blog post for LogRocket called Taming the Frontend Monolith, and that was the start of what we called already back then Piral, a framework for micro frontends. And then, of course, it was released officially during the O'Reilly Software Architecture Conference, where we gave a talk in November 2019. And of course, reaction was quite good. We already had back then quite some customers for production and pre-production purposes. And since then, it gained a lot, which, of course, for us meant that this is really a direction that is wanted from the community, but also that makes sense for us to maintain in the future. And shortly after we released Piral, another thing happened. A really great thing is that we got also great tooling in addition to it with Module Federation. So in March 2020, it was time. Module Federation came online. And since then, of course, the whole micro frontend landscape changed. This provided a really great basis with a very useful mental model, and formed just a really nice set that also allowed, let's say, pretty much all scenarios that you might think of. So not only, let's say, this hyperscaling approach, but also an approach where you say, I only got one tiny thing that I coded yesterday. I also want to integrate it very lightweight in a page. Well, this is the way to go, in my opinion. Really well done. And so the whole thing formed together, and now we can follow the words of Master Ukwe and say, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift. And that is why it is called the present. So this is how we arrive today. So what is the state of micro frontends as of today? Well, we have more companies using micro frontend solutions. So not only micro frontends, but really micro frontend solutions that can fit on the screen. That's just, let's say, some names that appeared over the years, and some names that have been just added now recently. But again, you can put in so many more names, and maybe one day I find enough time to make a slide where we only have, let's say, small dots, and each dot represents a company. But all these companies believe, of course, that micro frontends can solve a problem for them. And I guess they are right. I'm not sure, but usually they are right? So it can't be just hype driven, so there must be some truth behind it. Also, of course, what fits really nicely is that over the years, we not only gained knowledge, we also spread it, and we got some great books, hopefully great books if I look at the right side of this slide. But we have the books now from Luca, from Michael, and from me, and all these books, of course, will be given out in raffles for free today too, in some small amounts, but they are still up there to buy. And in my opinion, each of these books brings something to the table. So if you're really willing to spend a lot of money, buy all three. If you're not willing to spend a lot of money, buy. I'm not saying the name, so don't get me there. But anyway, we have the books, so this is also covered. And of course, we have the frameworks and tools. So either you start from scratch and you might use just something like Module Federation and build from there, because again, at the end of the day, this is more tools, so it isn't concerned with some of the things that you might want to look at. On the other hand, we have also something that only fulfills, let's say, the purpose of making different frameworks work together, like single spar. And then we have something like Piral, which really wants to drive in a direction of this hyper-scaling approach, where say you don't have just 2 or 3 or 5, but you have maybe the tens or maybe even the hundreds of micro frontends, and you can just get new micro frontends out really quickly. So all these things are there, they are viable. If you would look at the list of these properties, of course, single spar being a library, it doesn't do things like dependency sharing, for instance, but it works then nicely together with something like a module federation. And you can then easily add, of course, various things like a composition target. Now, isolation boundaries, they're always here not taken by these, and that's something I want to, let's say, touch briefly, because that's hopefully something we get into the web standard soon. If you want to have real isolation, of course, styling isolation is one thing. You can do that with web components and Shadow DOM, but real script isolation, there is, well, nothing that works better than iframes at the moment. And iframes have, of course, some disadvantages as well, right? So you couldn't do dependency sharing with iframes. It would be very difficult, very inefficient. And therefore, of course, your micro frontends would weigh a little bit more, would also have a higher performance budget. Now, in the future, we might have realms, and these things might work well, but right now we do not. And therefore, of course, this is a property that at least once you enter the client side with your micro frontends, you will have a very hard time fulfilling. But of course, if your micro frontends only do something on the server side, pre-render something also, you can have good isolation boundaries. But then again, this is a little bit up to you. Now, I also want to mention that for module federation here, we don't have the tooling independent part, because as it is today, there is support for some other bundlers, but it's still a Webpack technology. And what we have, and that's the closest we have, is native federation. And that really tries to be tooling independent, because after all, it just comes with the mental model, and you can implement that for pretty much any bundler very easily. But I'm still very hopeful, and we will see that in the last section of the talk, that we also check this box soon with Webpack Module Federation. And so we have this great tooling then that also is tooling independent at the end of the day, or let's say ready to be implemented in a lot of bundlers and build tools out of the box. So with that being said, I want to reflect a little bit on where I think Piral is today. It's a little bit as a reflection also on the state of micro frontends, but also where it is going for the next section. So how Piral works today is that you create an app shell. It can be as lightweight as possible, but it needs to have 2 properties, or at least one of them. One property is you need to use Piral for it. So that's why we usually call this app shell a Piral instance. And you need to have React in there. Well, there is also a way without it, but let's not talk about it, because it's more effort, and actually it's so much effort that you usually don't want to go there. And while this, let's say, worked quite well for us, of course, we see the disadvantage that even if you say Piral looks great and this is a great microfrontend framework, but we don't want to use React, or we don't want to use React for our app shell. Sure, again, you can keep it as lightweight as possible, but you would still need this. So keep that in mind. Now, the other thing is that as of today, you don't need a tooling that we call the Piral CLI, but it makes your life so much easier. You actually want to use it. And this is the tooling you use for building this app shell. So if, for instance, just as a food for thought, your app shell is now something with Next.js, and they use, of course, the Next.js tooling, you will have a hard time, right? But what the tooling, of course, does at the end of the day, and that is why it is so useful, is it generates two kind of artifacts. One is the so-called emulator, and that's a little bit the secret sauce of the Piral framework, because this allows you to really have a repository of a microfrontend somewhere else, and without any effort of creating a new environment or doing anything really special, allowing this one isolated repository somewhere owned by a completely different team, then they have no access to the core resources and whatsoever, to actually start a debugging session where they already see how the microfrontend looks like in the real application. And it follows a little bit the same philosophy that you have from, let's say, an Android emulator or an iOS emulator, right? Where you start developing an Android app and then suddenly on your computer, an image of an Android phone pops up with your app in there. And of course, you're not developing now against a real phone, but against this emulator, and it already shows you how your app would look like. You don't need to hot load it on your real phone or something, and that is something that really empowers you and lets you do a lot of work. Now, the other artifact that you get is a set of JavaScript, CSS, and HTML files, and that you can just now put on a website as static files, and it would just work, single-page application, and you're good. You could also maybe server-side render this thing, but it would always be stuck somewhere in this model where you already produced some artifacts, and they're tuned for actually single-page application usage. Now, what the microfrontend story is, again, they would work at development time. They have no runtime dependency whatsoever on this emulator, and you could use whatever framework you like. So Piral, as of today, supports, I would say, all the popular ones, including maybe the not so known ones. And just as a selection here, we see React, Angular, Vue, and Blazor. And the Blazor integration is actually one of the unique things about Piral. That's also something other frameworks don't have. But again, don't write a microfrontend solution with the intention of just having as many technologies as there is possible. Usually try to stay at a single technology, but that the underlying solution gives you the ability to also include some other technology. That's a great thing, because sometimes, well, just the teams come along and all they know is this one framework, and you want to encourage them. Or maybe there's a technical reason for doing that, that there's this great library, but it only exists for Blazor. Well, you can just integrate it. So that being said, that's nice, that's working. So how does that look now in the real world? Let's take now an example that we progress as we go along. And we take the example of Netflix. If you have seen one of my previous talks, you always know I love this Netflix example. And the reason is simple. You know it already, right? So you know Netflix, maybe you even have a subscription, but you know what it should do. So there is not much that I need to explain what is happening on the screen. So first, I want to show you how a monolithic Netflix application might look like. Now, I think we are at 9,000, and hopefully we are. That looks good. That looks good. Great. This is how the application looks. I think it behaves as it should. I can go somewhere, and there is this page, and I already added some things as favorites, right? So if I unclick them, then they are gone as favorites here on this page. And yeah, that's it. I can log in, I can log out, right? So this is how the page works in general. Now, from the code point of view, I mean, this is a monolithic architecture, so it's just one repository. We have all the components in here. We have, of course, some interleaving things. So as you have seen, we use, for instance, this favorite button a lot. So for instance, when we have the movie tile component here, this is React. So sorry for everyone not liking React or not using it, but you get the gist of it, I hope. It uses this favorite toggle component. This is this heart icon. And that's used also in a lot of other things. Like, for instance, here we have the hero component. So that's the big image that you see on the screen. It also uses the favorite toggle. So far, so good. So we have a kind of an interleaved thing. So if someone would now tell you, well, make different microphones out of it, or make this architecture more, let's say, nicer, because, well, I mean, as all monoliths, they just use that fact that all the things are just there and they can reference it, right? So that being said, you can do the same example and do it in a micro frontend kind of way. Now, the difference, of course, is that the micro frontend way will have more structure out of the box. So we will have this app shell that I mentioned before, and it will be really lightweight. If we look here at the components, it doesn't have anything that deals with the domain. It has a very standard loading component. It has a footer. It has the general app layout that just specifies where the logo goes, etc. And has some definitions for instance, how the navigation looks like. But keep in mind that the navigation, it doesn't contain any links. So you will not find anything here. Just here is a reference to a menu. If you look back at the monolith, if we look here in the app, what you can see is that the navigation, of course, contains already all these references to browse, favorites, etc., right? So the knowledge is always there, contained already in our monolith, whereas in our micro frontend solution that we have, well, it doesn't, let's say, use any knowledge. It just makes the app shell really this layout layer that combines the different things, comes up with Piral, but then all the knowledge, for instance, that there's a browse page, well, that's now placed in a different micro frontend. That is, of course, in this case, using Piral, so we call those pilots, but it's just a micro frontend. So what the pilot does is it has a special function called setup, and this function allows you to, well, register certain things, like, for instance, telling the app shell that there is a page, and this page is the browse page component. It should live at /browse. Now let's run this. Are we in the right thing? Yeah, I just wanted to run the spiral. Here, start. Right. Okay, dokie, and I think we are port 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Oh. And here we go. So the same experience as a user, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Of course, well, now we do, because this thing also uses another microphone called Surprise Me. But the thing is, there is no difference. Also in performance, it's the same. Alrighty. And we can even do certain things, right? This now gets the micro frontends from a feed. So it's loosely coupled to the micro frontends. You can enable and disable these micro frontends. And you even have this ability already doing it in the browser. So I could go in here and say, well, I don't want to see this. So you just hide it. Micro frontend is gone. It's just away. And the same applies for things like the favorites. Now you say, hold on, this thing is, well, embedded in various components. So how can this work? Well, quite simple. Since we still have this loosely coupled and we never reference components directly, you can just remove things and they will be removed consistently. So this removed the link. It also removed this one. It also removed this one. The page didn't crash or anything. It just keeps on working. And we have now this way and this mental model where things can just compose naturally and they will always work together. Now, what you will find out is if you create the single page application versus if you make it actually microphone solution, you get even better performance. I have to say we never tuned this for performance, so arguably you could maybe get even better with the single page application. But out of the box with the single page application, it was just set up not looking at performance. You get all, let's say, downgraded by bad CSS rules and maybe heavyweight images. But nevertheless, what you get here out of the box is a 73 performance score. Not great, not terrible, right? But now migrating that just blindly, again, not looking at performance, to micro frontends and doing the same, I mean, it's the same code, you get even better performance. The only thing you, let's say, introduce here is a little bit of this blocking time. And even that you can improve via prefetch and a little bit of server-side inclusion. So you could also bring that down, but let's say, put it out of the box, what you get something that performance-wise isn't performing worse. And quite often it performs even better because the micro frontend assets can be served from a CDN and always can be cached indefinitely. So even if the hot start would be about the same, the cold start, sorry, the hot start when you've been already at the website in the past will be better. Now, you only get benefits already from moving there. With that being said, we already believe that after quite some years of being in a preview version and really doing a lot of stuff, it's time today to actually press this button and make Piral a 1.0.0. And there are many reasons for doing that. Most importantly, I mean, we've not seen any changes dramatic in whatever region in the last months, and feedback we get from all sides is really great. So here we go. I just did it, and in a couple of minutes, this is live. So we got the 1.0.0 of Piral out there. Yay! Go Piral. Anyway, the evolution doesn't stop here, and bear with me because we still have the future section in front of us with some nice demos. And what is happening in the last, I would say, 2 years is that we have a little bit of a shift back to the server. But we need to be cautious here because that doesn't mean that the SPA is dead. I would actually say the SPA is far from that because there are good reasons for doing a SPA, and the developer experience shouldn't be, I mean, it was one of the original reasons, but it shouldn't be your main driver. The main driver that the SPA isn't that is that you still want to do really interactive experiences. And thinking of something like Figma, you wouldn't want to go for server-side rendering. You maybe want to server-side improve certain areas of that application. But going and stretching yourself just to say, I'm also rendering on the server initially, well, that isn't the goal, right? Many websites, especially in the e-commerce sector, they wouldn't benefit as a SPA. Or can you imagine Wikipedia being a SPA? That just doesn't sound right. So nevertheless, the future is certainly that multi-page applications that ran out of fashion a little bit, they will get the traction that they deserve also. But the SPA will also work still, and there will be something in the middle, and this middle is usually what is called islands. And the motivation is like that. Initially, with everything on the server, we remember the monolith, we served a lot of HTML, and then late 90s starting also some CSS. And CSS was growing quite a lot. And everything was getting posts to the view, so quite good. Now that's the static server-side monolith. That got improved with a little bit of interactivity, a little bit of JavaScript on the client, and of course, as we know, still have a get and a post, but this dynamic HTML where we just toggle things, we're not actually even fetching data. All is just, adding some fancy effect, that's all. That actually evolved, and we got state on the client suddenly. So things got really complicated, and we needed to have also state. And we also now wanted to grab this data from the backend to have that state. So suddenly we're opening APIs. And at this point, of course, JavaScript was growing. And from this Ajax approach, we actually then said, hey, wait a minute, I'm not duplicating things. Why don't I just move that view generation and that state, pretty much everything, but doesn't need to be everything, from the server to the client. Now we have really a lot of JavaScript, but only a tiny bit of HTML delivered. Still, CSS was growing and is there. But all that counts is now the data endpoints. And we are now in this separation with potentially microservices already, and that's the single-page applications. But wait a minute, I just told you that's not the end of the story, because we actually want to get performance back, right? And that means state and view should still be on the backend. Now, you also want your view and part of the state there, but you want it in a way that, well, doesn't interrupt you. You don't want to have this duplication. And this is where this island architecture comes in. So it allows you to lazy load things when they become necessary. Right. So islands of interactivity are formed. How can we leverage this? And this is, I think, where we enter the future of micro frontends, because we are at the moment in the last, let's say, half a year to a year exploring also server-side rendering options. And we've made a lot of progress. Zach alone made a lot of progress using Next.js with Module Federation, for instance, as a target. There are others working there. There are frameworks which embrace islands of interactivity and server-side rendering like Quick with really cool approaches. And they are also quite open. And we will hear some of these approaches during the conference. And I think we are about to see a real point where this matters. And in Piral, we also made some progress here. So just to give you a glimpse of what will happen with our version 2 of Piral, this looks almost like the first picture, but there is no React logo, just an HTML logo. That doesn't mean you now write it in HTML. That just means anything that goes with the web, essentially. And the Piral logo is now in dots. That essentially should mean that comes in isolated, just as a script that you can also embed on a website. You don't need to import it and have a build script. And that's the next thing that comes, right? The CLI will just be kind of a packager, and it will add on top or as a sidecar to the build tool, if you use any. If you just decide to, I don't know, ship your website as plain HTML with your favorite server-side rendering tool or whatever, that's also fine. Just include the script there. It's then a question how you form the emulator, but let's leave that on the sidetrack. Because again, what will happen is you get your emulator, and that's still something that we want to have because this has proven to be really great. And you get your release artifacts. But now these release artifacts, depending what you decide to do, will form something usable for any target. Now, I'm not talking about a silver bullet here, because you can't make a website that's, let's say, only working with Node.js because your app shell is now using endpoints and everything, and think that just now will work magically as a single page application. There are, of course, limits to that, right? But nevertheless, you can now have a thing where you say, I want to have an Electron app. And of course, your basis, your app shell should be an Electron app here, but you get out an Electron app. So you get a real application out. So any target means any target. And your app shell could be also React Native application. And you get out here React Native application, right? So that's what is meant here. And of course, for your micro frontends, the same thing applies with restrictions. And we have the HTML logo here present too. And what I mean with that is that it might also be that your micro frontend 1 is based on an Astro website, or your micro frontend 2 is based on a Next.js website. And so you have something that will require you to also have a server-side process and generate something, and it will just work in the end. And you can ship it as a micro frontend. And of course, that would only work now in the context of a server that's running. So your target should be a server if you start with something that includes a server. But in general, you can create solutions like that. And there are no restrictions on that side. And how that works, I want to show you with an example of Netflix again, but just this time server-side rendering. So I picked demo 4, and I will not get the demo 5 of here. It's the time, but let's see. It's essentially the same thing. So from the design, don't expect anything new, but it is definitely something new in terms of, if you look here, because we have now something in the server and something in the client. This is a structure you wouldn't see later in your project. It's now something for this demo. And the crucial part is that if I go to that site, let me just, I think we use 3000 here, don't we? What's the port? Yeah, that's the right port. Okay, so we just load this. By the way, we also get already our development tooling from Piral integrated, even though this thing is rendered server-side. And you can see that it's rendered server-side if you would look here, because not going into detail here, we're not loading any micro frontends. They're already there. And the performance is also great. So if I just refresh, okay. all these pictures, they are training here at my machine, but this thing is just working. I also want to show you something else, something that wouldn't have worked beforehand. I can go into settings here and disable the JavaScript. Now this will make a reload. Not sure why it's not so slow. Anyway, but it just reloaded, and as you can see, it still works. That wouldn't have worked with the single page example. I can also press login, and I go to this page, and I can now log in as well. Now I could also make add to favorites work, but just for the sake of argument, I told it not to work. So pressing it doesn't do anything. So for this, I would need JavaScript. But I could also make this work on the server if I'm not lazy here, or if I don't want to get a point. Because again, this thing would just work now with JavaScript. And going to the favorites page, for instance, you see that these three things are added. So that being said, now how does it work? It works the same as beforehand, which is the magic. So if you would look into the browse pilot and you look here, it's okay, we're getting a little bit too far of ourselves. We also have just a setup function, right? And we also register just components here, like menu, for instance. They just lazy load things, and the server then defines if we want to render that or not. Now here, for instance, we are even saying, and we don't need to say that, but we can say that we don't want to have it rendered on the client. Still, of course, it will appear, but it will not rehydrate. So this thing you can actually really fine-tune. And there are some things you actually don't want to work with because, well, we only implemented them for the client for interactivity. And I think the search is one of them. So here you, for instance, say, do not render this on the server. And you can even go as far as saying only hydrate this when it's visible and things like that. So all the tool belt that you know from working with island architectures in Quick, for instance, or in Astro, that works here as well. And I think that's quite cool because that really allows you to have something that gets you most performance out and having no effort at all, right? And we call these things that make anything work actually presets. And that will actually introduce any platform, any tooling, and any composition. So meaning that Replan, Astro, Electron, Blazor, React Native, Next.js would work in there to start a micro frontend button, would also work, for instance, to get something out. The tooling of these platforms, it would just work. Closed beta for this is starting soon, so we will make another announcement, I guess, in a few weeks, and then everyone who's interested might get access to the packages. We will need to see how many are interested and what we can cope from a feedback point of view. But that's what's happening. We are quite sure that we will not release version 2 this year, but again, closed beta is starting soon. Then we will do an open beta, and when it's ready, it's ready. But others also, of course, shape the future. And one thing that we want to do also with this Piral version 2 is embrace module federation, because I think we are also here at an inflection point. The module federation universal is a highly discussed topic, and I think it is close to completion, such that really we get a spec out and we implement it. And that we see that in, for instance, native federation is also a good thing, right? And that's also, of course, a path we can explore. Still, there are some issues like the one that I have opened here. But in general, native federation also is a viable path. And maybe we can also support multiple things here, and that depends potentially on the preset. We are not sure yet what direction to go. All we know is that these are all really good things happening. So, in conclusion, what do we see here? Especially for the future, we see some consolidation in the tooling sector, in the framework sector. We see, of course, some divergence because some tools will be more specialized in certain areas, but that's fine. That's good because we believe also in choice, as mentioned. And we think that the tools will, of course, continue to improve together with the web standards, and the tools will also align and hopefully to form a better basis for everyone being involved. And so it's all about choice. And with that, I want to thank you. I want to wish you all a nice conference. I hope that you will have a lot of luck during the raffles. and would appreciate any exchange that happens during the conference or after. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Florian, thank you so much for your for your talk and the interesting content, and of course the great news about Piral 1.0. We also had a question in the chat asking when will there be version 1.0 of Piral. I think you gave the answer already during the talk.
Yes, I would say in about 20 minutes, hopefully, if there's nothing with the build going sideways, like NPM having a bad time or something like that.
Okay, good. So we have quite a series of questions. I don't think we can cover all of them now. We will start with the first ones, but we will answer the questions later on and then send the answers via email to all participants, and also the ones which we have in the Discord channel. We will record, we will track them and provide answers for them. So here's the first one to you, Florian. So have you tested micro frontend architecture in meta frameworks just as the Nuxt.js?
Yeah, in general, yes, but in the particular case of Nuxt.js, no. And of course, it works a little bit similar to, let's say, dedicated server-side frameworks like Podium, for instance. So, of course, it's possible in general, but it's always a matter of how much implementation effort would there be and what would be the gain for you. But in general, yes, it's possible to do micro frontends with such media frameworks.
Okay, thank you. Then the next one is probably it's not jumping in. Here we go. It's probably not so easy to answer. Maybe you're also not the right person to give the ultimate answer to that. But what is your experience and opinion on single spa and how much is it used, and is it still, let's say?
They didn't have a release in quite some time. I think over a year now. I think it was version 6 or so. They didn't release it. And there was also an issue open. If the project is still alive, that issue remained open for quite some time. And then it was closed from one of the maintainers saying, yeah, it's still maintained, but right now everyone's busy. So generally, I see that single spa is alive from the point of view that the community uses it. Also, some adapters, like for instance, the Angular adapter, have been updated recently, but the core framework seems to be dormant at this point in time. Not want to say now if it's a good or bad thing. That depends now how we are, let's say, reliant you are that it's dormant or not dormant. That, for instance, you're waiting on something there, then it's a bad thing, of course. So I would say in general it is alive, but it might not be as active and maintained as it was, let's say, a year ago.
Okay, thank you very much for your opinion and answer to that. Then next question is, never heard about Piral. Is it popular? So maybe you can share one or the other, let's say, implementation from a size and success. We will have later on also another talk. So I think it's the fourth talk where also Piral will be discussed and covered. So maybe you can share some of those implementations.
I mean, popular is relative. So you haven't heard it, you have heard of others. So in your case, it's not popular. Let's say talking in metrics, it's definitely not as popular as, for instance, Module Federation as a tool, right? Or Single Spa as a library. But I would say among these frameworks that try to solve everything end to end, it might be the most popular solution. There are others out there. Or maybe I should say most popular solution outside of China, because surprisingly in China, there are sometimes solutions that we don't know in the Western world for, I don't know, whatever reason, they are quite popular there. So I would say it's one of the popular solutions. And if you rank it among the most popular, depends certainly on what you put in as categories and what you put in as, let's say, your radar. But I would say it is not uncommon to use it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And sorry for the one regarding the size of the. So our largest installation has around 100 micro frontends in there, and it's running very smoothly. It's in production since, I think it's soon, no, 6 years it's not, but it's 5 years and 2 months now. Yeah. So quite long time.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then let's take a final question so that we have time for a ruffle and also a short break. So which is a general question, which is about, okay, good. When is it a good idea to use micro frontends architecture pattern? And then what are, let's say, the key use cases where you would say, yes, this is the ideal case for MFEs?
Yeah. So in general, of course, if you have a working monolith, then there is no reason to change that because, I mean, you're not feeling any struggle. Don't change that. Monolith is quite often there are also drawbacks with micro frontends. It's a distributed system after all. There must be some drawbacks, and there are. So don't go there if you don't need to. But on the other hand, you want to go to micro frontends or a distributed system if you either see that from an organization point of view, it makes sense because you have some features you can't, let's say, ship or line, or the time the market is otherwise drastically sinking, or you have teams that are not allowed to see everything of the source code for whatever reason. And the other thing that might be is actually a technical reason. You have a solution up front which you want to modularize anyway, because then the patterns that are there in micro frontends, they actually help you to modularize it already. So as an example, what we do with our Piral feed service that also ships with a UI, it also uses already these pilots, so micro frontends, because depending on what we ship, for instance, our software as a service solution, that is a public community service out there in the cloud, it has a different set of features than, for instance, what your pro license has, that has more usually, and also a little bit of a different feature set. And we don't want actually to ship those in the UI already. So we compose already at build time, you can say, but partially also at runtime, what the UI should be, and we compose it from all these different modules. Now, do you need micro frontends for that? Maybe not, but it already, as mentioned, helps us. And using therefore something like Piral just helps us because it solves this technical issue here.